Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We now explore the African island nation of Sao Tome and Principe, nearby Central Africa, and who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our returning champion, the brilliant historian and journalist and activist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Report, who will be our guide on this trip to Sao Tome and Principe's history and current affairs. And just before first off, Abayomi, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for the ongoing series on African history and African contemporary affairs. It's been very helpful.
Well, and as always, Abayomi, it's always an honor and a real privilege to have you as our history teacher and our African correspondent, basically. So my thanks and appreciation of the time you give. And just before we just before we get into our topic, as always, folks, please donate generously to Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports, and please donate generously to One Plus One if you can. Share all of our content, past and present, and help us overcome the far-right algorithms and help us overcome the monopoly Western corporate media and state media has in the social media world by sharing all of One Plus One's content and, again, donating to us. And another thing, just before we get to the topic, I have been having some problems sharing my content on Facebook. Facebook has been blocking me from sharing my content on the many left-wing groups I'm part of, where I share One Plus One's content. And Abayomi was saying to me off the air that he also has been having a problem sharing my content, but he says that when he goes directly to YouTube and shares the content from there, he's able to do that. So, folks, if you have been having a hard time sharing my content and Facebook has been blocking it, I would greatly appreciate it. Go directly to the YouTube video of One Plus One, and share via Twitch or share via Facebook all of my content from there. It'll really help us overcome it because if One Plus One is having a hard time, Facebook is literally my lifeline to sharing my content. Then I'm afraid I might have to, give up doing One Plus One. Do not want to give up doing One Plus One. So if you can share the contents like that, it would be really great. Or email all of your friends. Especially if you're a left-wing activist, please do share One Plus One through email and share it to amongst the the different groups, and would greatly appreciate that. All right.
I've also noticed on X there hasn't been a problem. I share all the One Plus One broadcasts, the interviews we've been doing over the last few months on X, and it has not been blocked there. At least it doesn't appear to be, at least on my account. Who knows? But who knows?
Great. That is great to know. That is great to know. Mm-hmm. All right. So again, folks, please do that. Otherwise, there's no One Plus One. So, all right. Now on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, as always, tell us what was Sao Tome and Principe like before Portuguese colonization? How did it become a Portuguese colony? And of course, what were the conditions of the people under Portuguese colonization?
Well, this is a point I think that's relevant to African history or African historical periodization in general. It is said by modern day archaeologists and geologists that Sao Tome and Principe had their origins in volcanic eruptions tens of thousands of years ago. Yeah. They also claim, and I believe this is a Portuguese historical narrative, that both Sao Tome and Principe were uninhabited prior to the intervention of Portuguese colonialism.
The old Terra Nullius.
Yes, and I have a problem with that. I think there needs to be more research done on whether or not that's accurate, because the Portuguese arrived in the 1470s, and there were two explorers who came initially. Eventually, they appointed a colonial administrator. Sao Tome is the larger of the islands, and Principe is the smaller. We have to understand that these island territories, mainland territories, the divisions came years and even centuries later. There's no historical context to look at, for example, Sao Tome and Principe as being any different from some of the other territories in the area, particularly in the Gulf, so-called Gulf of Guinea. For example, you have a situation where countries like Gabon, for example, which is like 350 kilometers away from Sao Tome, and then you have places such as the Central African Republic, Angola, and so forth. These areas were only divided after the intervention of the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. So Sao Tome and Principe largely became slave territories. They were heavily used as a transportation port for the importation and export of Africans, enslaved Africans, for forced labor. That happened on the islands, and it also served as a conduit for capturing Africans from the mainland and exporting them to the Western Hemisphere. So this is very, very important to understand the history of these two islands. They were Portuguese colonial territories, but they were built up as economic units through the Atlantic slave trade. And this is very, very important. These were slave islands that were controlled by the Portuguese, and they imported many, many people from the mainland and from other islands to serve as slaves and also as participants in the Portuguese slave system. People were also exported. Many of them were exported to Brazil. And even during the subsequent centuries, people were still being captured and exported to Brazil and other territories in the Western Hemisphere. So Sao Tome and Principe was a Portuguese, islands territory for the specific purpose of forced labor. Later, during the 16th century, it became an outpost for the development of sugar plantations. Huge, huge exports of sugar from Sao Tome and Principe. There's diversity in the geographical makeup of the island, particularly the largest one, Sao Tome. You have the areas that are more flat, that are conducive to agricultural production. You also have a more rugged space, which is mountainous, which played a key role in the resistance against slavery and colonialism. The major cash crop, the first one that was developed under the Portuguese slave system, was sugar. And this was facilitated by the rise of sugar mills after around 1515 on Sao Tome. The development of these sugar mills fostered mass production and refinement of sugar for export. So that became the major cash crop under the slave system. But immediately, there was resistance on the part of the Africans on Sao Tome and Principe against the slave and colonial system. As early as 1595, there was a major revolt during that particular time period, and it was led by a man by the name of Amador. History says he mobilized 5,000 Africans, and they attacked the sugar plantations. They destroyed almost 80–90% of the sugar mills on Sao Tome, and they killed a lot of the plantation owners. Nonetheless, eventually they were overcome by the Portuguese militias who had superior weaponry. But this just illustrated the fact that there was resistance to slavery and colonialism on the African continent. And also, it's very, very important to recognize that this resistance came about under the most harsh and extreme conditions imaginable during that particular time period. So the uprising in 1595 on Sao Tome and Principe really prefigured The Quilombos, which were the independent African communities in Brazil that developed during the 16th and 17th centuries. Also, prefigured the Haitian Revolution by 2 centuries
Ah,
because it was a similar
interesting.
scenario. If you
Yeah.
look at it, 1791, there was the uprising led by Boukman and Auguste, and this lasted for 13 years. In 1791, they destroyed all the sugar plantations, the sugar mills, burned down plantations, and so forth on Haiti. And it was a similar pattern that had developed 200 years before on Sao Tome on the part of the Africans who resisted Portuguese enslavement. So this defies this false notion that Africans on the continent never resisted European enslavement. So this is totally false. This
Exactly.
is the narrative that was created by the Europeans and the Americans themselves to justify the oppression and the exploitation that took place under slavery and colonialism, to say that Africans themselves cooperated with the Atlantic slave trade. Looking at the history of Sao Tome and Principe, those Africans that did participate did so under coercive mechanisms. They were forced to do so. They also encouraged and recruited people from other territories in Africa and even in Europe to come to Sao Tome to participate in the facilitation of the Atlantic slave trade. But the Africans resisted there, and they resisted in other parts of the continent, which we've talked about over the last several weeks. So we need to look at this historical narrative that has been fostered by Portugal, by Britain, France, the United States, Germany, and so forth, to analyze these assumptions. For example, the belief that was fostered that these islands were uninhabited. There was nobody there before the Portuguese came. Also, that the Africans themselves never resisted the onslaught of enslavement, which is totally false. And that's why the system was so oppressive, because people were resisting. And there was a development of maroon communities on Sao Tome, people who fled the enslaved system, the forced labor, fled into the mountains, formed their own communities, and served as a source of resistance against Portuguese enslavement and colonialism, to the extent that by the mid 17th century, the slave system on Sao Tome and Principe was already very much in decline. And the sugar plantations, a lot of them had been destroyed. They did not have adequate labor to maintain them. So it reverted back away from sugar production, large scale sugar production, to being a conduit for the capture and export of Africans for the purpose of enslavement, somewhat in Europe, but more so in the Western Hemisphere.
Wow, unbelievable. And then is it safe to say, before I ask how Sao Tome and Principe became independent and whether it was a peaceful transition or one of violent struggle, so Portugal was under a fascist dictatorship, a far right dictatorship, but yeah, very much classical European fascist dictatorship, just like Spain under Franco, Greece under the far right junta, which came much later during the Cold War. But yeah, but Portugal was under basically a Portuguese version of fascism. So during all that time, because Sao Tome, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, because all of them had their independence very late. So when the Portuguese fascist system collapsed, and it took great people power struggle in Portugal, what's often called the Carnation Revolution, to overthrow it. That was when Portugal's colonies like East Timor, Sao Tome, Angola, and so forth got their independence. But during that period, so when we're talking about the 50s, in the 60s, where the conditions of the people of Sao Tome still very horrendous, still very exploitative, and no wealth or profits that were made went into developing the island, and so forth. Yeah, I'm curious your response to that before we talk about how it became independent.
Yes. What happened was that Portugal was outpaced by the other European colonial powers. So was Spain. Places such as the Netherlands, France, Britain, and even Germany became more dominant
Yeah.
economically in Europe and worldwide as the centuries proceeded. And as I mentioned, a lot of that had to do with the rebellions that took place within the Portuguese colonies between the 16th and the 19th centuries. And it's important to recognize that during the 19th century, there was two more cash crops that became dominant in Sao Tome and Principe, and those were the development of coffee and cocoa. In fact,
Yeah.
cocoa became the major export from Sao Tome and Principe during the 19th century, and that exists even up until today. They're still one of the largest producers of cocoa in the world. But this was also based upon forced labor. Now, the forced labor was done in several ways, under enslavement and then later under colonization. Ostensibly, the Portuguese eliminated slavery in 1876, ostensibly. But
Exactly.
in other ways, it continued. And 1876 is a very, very interesting year because this is the same year in the United States where you had the so-called Hayes-Tillman Compromise of 1876, which is a marker utilized for the destruction and the demise of federal reconstruction in the United States.
Okay.
We know that between 1861 and 1865, there was a civil war in the United States that pitted the Confederate States of America against the United States of America. And what happened was that the Confederates lost. They could not defeat the Northern armies, which were backed by the industrial capitalists who were on the rise, even though they were dependent heavily upon cotton production for the textile mills in the North, as well as in the UK. It was heavily dependent on Southern cotton production. So in 1876, after the end of the Civil War and the so-called Reconstruction period, where slavery was ended officially, and we just commemorated Juneteenth yesterday,
Yes.
which is one aspect of the decline of enslavement in the United States. But you had the passage of the 13th Amendment, which didn't take place until December of 1865. It was ratified by the U.S. Congress. Then in 1868, there was the passage of the so-called 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which purportedly gave Africans in the United States citizenship, meaning that they had a right to due process, they had a right to serve on juries, and so forth. But this, of course, has been challenged. It was challenged during the 1860s and 70s, and it's still being challenged today. Because what did President Trump say? He wanted to eliminate birthright citizenship, which is enshrined in the 14th Amendment. So in essence, they could say that I'm not a citizen, even though I can trace my ancestry back 5, 6 generations in North America. But we were not considered citizens until after 1868 officially. Now, there was a Civil Rights Act of 1866, and there were other Civil Rights Acts and so forth. But what I'm trying to point out is that in 1876, the federal government withdrew its forces from the former colonial Confederate states. And of course, after that period, they instituted legalized segregation, or Jim Crow. Separate but equal became the law of the land. And this continued all the way up until the 1950s and 1960s. Also in 1876, marked the period in which the Belgian colonialists entered as emissaries of the king, Leopold, into Congo. And between 1876 up until 1908, was pretty much run as a fiefdom of the Belgian monarchy. So the point I'm making is that that was a very, very important year. And in 1876, supposedly they abolished slavery, but it's been documented that even as late as the 1890s, there was still forced labor that was taking place on Sao Tome and Principe Islands. Okay, during the 20th century, with the development of coffee and cocoa, forced labor continued inside the country. There were harsh conditions that people lived under. What was the turning point, though, was in 1953. There was a work stoppage on the part of the people living on Sao Tome, who were already resisting the forced labor. There was a proposal by the Portuguese colonial authorities to bring in people from other African territories in order to subject them to forced labor. There was a strike, and in retaliation for that, the Portuguese colonial authorities killed hundreds of Africans. This was in 1953. And this was a rebellion that really changed the course of history in Sao Tome and Principe. It was called the Batepa Massacre. And the Portuguese claimed that this work stoppage, this strike, this resistance against the forced labor in 1953 was a result of a communist plot. So they accused the resistance forces of being communists, and then they massacred hundreds of them during that particular time period. The colonial administrator was withdrawn after this massacre in 1953, but he was withdrawn not as a form of punishment, but he was actually promoted to a higher position within the Portuguese system. But they sent an investigative team to Sao Tome, and it was found out that no, there was no communist plot, that the conditions there forced people to rise up against colonialism. In 1960, we had the formation of the Movement for the Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe, the MLSTP, and in 1961, they joined forces with other anti-colonial progressive liberation movements, such as the MPLA of Angola, the Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo of Mozambique, the African Party for the Independence of Cape Verde and Guinea, the PAIGC, and they formed alliances with these parties into a group called CONCEPT, the Alliance of Nationalist Movements within the Portuguese colonies. And they coordinated their activities. People like Amilcar Cabral, Dr. Agostinho Neto, Eduardo Malande, and later Samora Machel were all a part of this process known as CONCEPT. And they did this to distinguish themselves from the so-called liberation movements, which were promoted by the US and also by the Portuguese colonialists. Forces like UNITA, for example, the other group that was in the northern part of Angola at that particular time period, led by Holden Roberto. So they wanted to distinguish themselves from the collaborationists. So this is what happened. And as you mentioned, the armed struggles escalated, particularly in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. And it weakened the Portuguese colonial system, which was already at an extreme disadvantage in regard to NATO and other Western European colonial powers. And eventually, by 1974, there was a coup d'etat against the fascist Portuguese rulers.
Yeah.
And some junior army officers took over, and the first proclamation that they made was to relinquish control of their colonial territories in Africa and other parts of the world. So this is what happened in 1974. So Sao Tome and Principe gained their independence in July of 1975 under the leadership of the Movement for the Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe.
So safe to say it was a combination of so it was a combination of a violent struggle, but then later a peaceful transition. But the administration, the Portuguese administration, their hands had to be forced to it.
Exactly. And even though a lot of Africans died and were brutally repressed, their resistance had an impact going all the way back to the 16th century, particularly the revolt of 1595, the other revolts that took place during the 17th and the 18th century, the struggle against forced labor, and the production of coffee and cocoa during the 19th century. And of course, the combined efforts of concept created a crisis for the Portuguese fascist colonial system that had developed under Salazar, then later under Catano.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
And we have to remind ourselves that the U.S. supported this ongoing colonial war that was being waged by the Portuguese during the 1960s all the way up to 1974. In fact, they used the Azores Islands in the North Atlantic as a place that was actually transferred control from Portugal to the United States during the Vietnam War. NATO supplied weapons and strategic assistance, intelligence coordinates to the Portuguese during the war in the 1960s and early 1970s. So yes, the U.S. was heavily involved in this attempted suppression of the national liberation movements in the former Portuguese colonies during the 1960s and 1970s. We could go back and look at the memorandum, National Security Memorandum, that was issued by Henry Kissinger, who had served as Secretary of State as well as National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon and later Gerald R. Ford after Nixon's resignation. That NSSM memorandum of 1969 outlined the fact that in their belief that the national liberation movements could not win the wars of liberation in the former Portuguese colonies and other areas in Southern Africa. So therefore, the U.S. policy would be to continue their alliance with the settler colonial regimes, with the Portuguese colonial system, and try to promote reforms to prevent the situation from deteriorating politically. Yet, the actual outcome of that was totally different. In fact, they did collapse. The Portuguese colonial system collapsed in 1974. Those countries gained their independence in 1975. Of course, there was a huge civil war in Angola from 1975 all the way up until 1988, 1989. And that conclusion of that war, with the intervention of the Cuban internationalist forces, led to the withdrawal of South African defense forces and colonial forces from Namibia. Namibia became independent in 1990. This created the conditions for the release of political prisoners, the unbanning of the ANC and other liberation movements, and the democratic breakthrough of 1994 in the Republic of South Africa. So all of these struggles are interrelated.
Yeah.
All of them are interrelated, and studying the history of Sao Tome and Principe, proves, as we have discussed in previous episodes, that Africans resisted the onslaught of European colonialism and imperialism and the Atlantic slave trade on the continent as well as in the diaspora. So this history has been hidden, and it's deliberate. And we have a reinforcement of that attempt to hide this history under the current Trump administration, which has denigrated Africa, denigrated the African people, and also imposed sanctions on school systems, even universities, for daring to even discuss the actual history of the United States and indeed the world. We see what's happening at Harvard, where they've suspended grants for even scientific research, let alone attacking people who want to do research on the history of Palestine or the history of colonialism in Africa, so in Asia and Latin America. So the struggle continues well into the 21st century.
Unbelievable. So talk to us about Sao Tome and Principe's early years as an independent country, and talk to us about the legacy of its first two democratically elected leaders, Miguel Trovoado, apologies if I'm butchering his name, and his successor, Celestino Rocha da Costa, both of the Party Movement for the Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe, Social Democratic Party, and both ruled during the final two chapters of the Cold War, the 70s till 1991. And so talk to us about those two.
Yeah, Manuel Pinta de Costa was one of the founders and leaders of the MLSTP and became president in 1975 after the collapse of the Portuguese colonial system. And in the early years, there was a strong alliance with other liberation movements and political parties that had also fought under the Alliance of Concept. Also, there was a socialist orientation for the MLSTP during this particular time period. They had strong ties with Cuba, the German Democratic Republic, and the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This took place between 1975 up until the end of the late 1980s. And we all know what happened beginning in the late 1980s. And in some countries even earlier, for example, in Poland, with the imposition of the state of emergency in 1981, and eventually the reforms there that brought the Solidarity trade union, which became a party, to power. But in other countries, for example, Hungary, Bulgaria, the German Democratic Republic, Romania, by 1989, all of these states had collapsed internally. And the USSR under Gorbachev refused to defend the socialist and communist parties of these states, and even politically allowed them to collapse. Even within the Soviet Union itself, by 1989, 1990, they were already drawing back aid to other Comecon states. For example, Cuba faced a special period during this time, where they withdrew aid that had been provided, had been a lifeline to the Republic of Cuba since 1960, 1961, when they announced their socialist orientation, and the U.S. imposed sanctions and eventually a full-scale embargo against the Republic of Cuba, simply because they nationalized industries that were controlled by the United States. Those hotels, those casinos, which were owned by the mafia, were shut down. The multinational corporations that control the oil industry and others, sugar industry in Cuba, were nationalized by the Castro government during the early 1960s. So this was the same pattern, a similar pattern that was followed in Sao Tome and Principe. It's important, though, to point out that the population there, even today, estimated at 225,000 people. It's not a lot of people there. And it's my belief that just like in Equatorial Guinea that we talked about last week, the advent of the slave system and the colonial system of forced labor and exploitation had a lot to do with the low population that exists there today. And what's also interesting about these territories and nation states is that their resistance was based upon a Pan-African model. A lot of people on Sao Tome and Principe were brought there from as far away as the Niger Delta. Some were brought there from Gabon and other African states for the purpose of undermining the people who were already there, and also for the demand for labor, because people fled the lowlands. They fled the sugar plantations and the coffee and cocoa plantations and joined these maroon communities in the mountains who consistently engaged in raids and killing of plantation owners and slave owners on Sao Tome and Principe. So we have to look at the role of enslavement and colonialism in the overall demographic character of these countries all the way up to the 21st century. Nonetheless, after 1990, we talked about the socialist orientation in the first decade and a half. After 1990, there was a tremendous amount of political pressure on the part of African states and other states, not just the ones in Europe, not just the ones in Eastern Europe, not just the Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia, which began to collapse after 1991, even though they had not been closely allied with the Soviet Union. even going back to the period of Stalin, there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of political agitation around multi-party democracy. So you had parties that had functioned, like the MLSTP had functioned as a one-party socialist-oriented state.
Okay.
Even within that party itself, within the Central Committee in 1990 at a Congress, voted to open up the country to multi-party democracy. And this opened the way for more right-wing or centrist parties to gain dominance.
Yeah.
And it became a huge struggle between the so-called Independent Democratic Action, the IDA, and the MLSTP. And that struggle continues until today. So we could talk more about, this internal struggle that's taking place in Sao Tome and Principe as a result of the liberalization of the political system.
That's unbelievable. So it sounds to me, if I understand correctly, that Sao Tome and Principe, so similar to Cuba, not exactly like Cuba, but very similar to Cuba. They had socialism, which would have addressed generation upon generations of very deep grievances that need to be addressed through socialism. And there's going to be there's going to be a lot of successes, and then there's going to be a lot of setbacks. That happened, and then it sounds as if they were kind of on the road, or simply a country that's trying to deal with decades and centuries of crap that the Portuguese colonial system left. But as they're forced to adopt multi-party democracies, that's actually when all the setbacks really start to happen. So talk to us about Sao Tome under the leadership of Daniel Daio and Norberto Costa Alegre, both from the Democratic Convergence Party, which is very much a classical right-wing party. And interesting how just at the end of the Cold War and the dawn of the unipolar capitalist world led by the U.S., this party gets into power in Sao Tome. So tell us, what led them getting into power, and how do you assess their legacy in the early 90s?
Well, the notion that the economic stagnation within the socialist and socialist-oriented countries was somehow due to the lack of democratic practice, the lack of multi-party democracy, proved to be a major error. Even the MLSTP, the Movement for the Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe, changed its name after the 1990 Congress to include the Social Democratic Party as well, the PSD. So, and we saw this even in the United States and other countries where even within the Communist Party in the United States during the early 1990s, there was a huge split, over those who wanted to either liquidate the Communist Party or turn the Communist Party into a social democratic party, and they had a split as a result of that. And even some leading figures who had been with the CP began to call themselves democratic socialists, or they're in favor of a democratic form of socialism. But we have to go back and look at how you define socialism under capitalism and socialism. I mean, how do you define democracy under capitalism as opposed to democracy under socialism? So this has been a debate, that's gone on for well over a century, since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, because some of the opponents of the Bolshevik Revolution claim that they should have allowed the Kerensky provisional government to run its course, and that the Bolsheviks, even though they only constituted a small percentage of the population of the monarchy in Russia, and that they took over the control of the Soviets, and they seized power, even though they did not have a numerical majority inside the country. So some people did not support them for that reason. And there were other reasons too. Their positions, for example, on the right of nations to self-determination. There was a whole debate between Rosa Luxemburg and V.I. Lenin during the early days of the revolution over the question of the
Yeah.
right of self-determination of nations and so forth. So this is what happened, went on in the late 80s, early 1990s, and it actually opened the way, for other rightist, neoliberal parties to take power. The IDA, for example, had been allied with these Christian Democratic International,
Yeah, yeah,
which no
exactly,
longer calls
exactly.
itself the Christian Democratic International.
It's even in my
It has a
notes.
different name now because they're allowing in people from Islamic countries, Asian countries, and so forth, outside of Europe and other parts of the world. So it's a problem. And it has not solved the economic crisis in Africa or in Europe, for that matter. What we've seen in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Central Europe, and Western Europe, and the UK, is the rise of neo-fascist parties. We've seen that happening,
And
particularly
it's and it's
over the last decade.
and it's also ironic that that just at the time that Sao Tome and Principe enters into a socialist alliance, it's the Western European social democrats, and I would even argue the Nordic social democrats,
Mm-hmm.
who actually start to pivot more and more to the right, and even because the
Mm-hmm.
because the movement for liberation of Sao Tome and Principe Social Democratic, they are a member of of those of
Yeah.
Socialist International and Progressive Alliance. Even but those organizations are dominated by Western European and Nordic social democratic parties who already in the 80s were starting to pivot more and more to the right. And it's so that's interesting. And then so how do you assess the time in office? Although he wasn't president for a long he wasn't president for a long period of time, but the legacy of Evaristo Carlo of the other right wing party that you mentioned, the ADI, the Independent Democratic Action, which is a member of Centrist Democrat International, which is where Christian democratic right leaning and fairly right wing parties globally gather to see how they can help one another and advance a very right wing agenda, economic liberal agenda.
Well, it hasn't improved the economy to the degree in which they had hoped. There was prospects for oil exploration in the Gulf of Guinea, and that has not materialized. They involved themselves in negotiations with the Federal Republic of Nigeria some years ago. They did reach an agreement to do a joint exploration for petroleum resources in the Gulf of Guinea, but it is not materialized. So what you have is a continuation of neocolonialism in another form, because even today, a lot of the economic activity is based upon trade with Portugal. So in terms
Wow.
of cocoa and other goods, a lot of the products that are sold inside of Sao Tome and Principe are imported through Portuguese corporate and economic channels. So still, there's a lack of economic interaction with other African states. Angola, for example, it appears to be the largest one of the larger African trading partners with Sao Tome and Principe, and they have a similar background in terms of Portuguese colonialism. And, of course, they fought together during the anti-colonial struggle of the 1960s and the 1970s. But still, the population, which is relatively small, we're talking about not even 250,000 people, 225 million people, whose economic lifeline still is heavily centered around trade with Portugal and goods that are transported to the country through Portuguese economic channels.
And from 1994 to 2001, the movements for liberation of Sao Tome and Principe Social Democratic Party was in power. Its leaders were the following: Carlos Graça Armindo Vaz de Almeida, Raul Braganana Nitso. Forgive me if I'm butchering those names, and Guilherme Posodera Costa. How do you assess this fairly long time That's actually a pretty fairly long time for a left-leaning party in office. Was much good achieved during this period, or like so many trends where you have a left-wing party or a left-leaning party gets into power, they talk a lot and promise a lot of left-wing policies, but ends up governing from the right, much to the dismay and detriment of the majority poor and working class or working poor in Sao Tome and Principe. And again, just a side note for people who might be interested, the party again is a member of both Socialist International and Progressive Alliance, and the party is supposed to be on paper a broad church of the left, from democratic socialism to social democracy to left nationalism to even being influenced by Marxism, Leninism, and having a far right left wing base. But as you mentioned, in the beginning, they actually were a Marxist Leninist party, but then they felt pressured to go along with the trend of their Portuguese social democrats and the Western European social democrats and the Nordic social democrats to adopt democratic socialism and actually lessen, be less radical. So I'm curious your response to all of that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a trend during that particular time period. It had a lot to do with what was happening in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So Africa, particularly a small territories like Sao Tome and Principe, do not exist in isolation. They are impacted by developments, particularly those that arise in the former colonial territories, and also the broader imperialist powers, for example, the United States and Britain. So yes, they are influenced by that. And the notion that somehow the one-party rule was a detriment to economic development and the realization of genuine democracy was, of course, an error. It proved to be an error in Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia, and also in the former Soviet Union. China has maintained their position. Cuba has maintained its position. And China, for example, is an example of economic development. The fact that in 76 years they've taken their people out of poverty shows the superiority of the socialist system. Even the former Soviet Union, even though it was strained by the so-called Cold War, they were
Uh-oh.
during World War II.
Abayomi, can you repeat that again? Sorry, there's a problem with my internet.
Just wanted to
About the
reemphasize.
Soviet Union, about the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the Soviet Union was able to eliminate unemployment by the 1930s. They were able to build their territory. They broke the back of the German army under the Third Reich between 1941 and 1943. They chased the Nazi army, across Europe all the way back into Germany, and got to Berlin before the Western Allied forces. So the point I'm making is that socialism has advanced world civilization. But the ideological struggle between imperialism and capitalism and socialism and communism, or Marxism, Leninism, is ongoing. So there's attacks that are ongoing against the national liberation movements, against independent anti-imperialist states like Iran, for example, the former Syrian Arab Republic,
Which
and
sadly has
others
fallen, yeah.
have been under attack. Even Iraq, under the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party of Saddam Hussein and before Saddam Hussein, was brought down by Western imperialism. So yes, I don't think that those decisions led to economic development and even a greater enjoyment of democracy. Because you can't have democracy under a capitalist system that is becoming more and more centralized and that is in deeper and deeper crisis. If we look what is happening in Europe with the rise of these neo-fascist parties, for example, in France, in Germany with the AfD, France with the National Rally, you have the the so-called Reform UK in Britain. These are all neo-fascist parties. And a lot of the momentum for the broadening of the electoral base of these parties has been the fallout of the wars that have been waged in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, and Afghanistan, and also the declining economic situation in Africa, which has forced people to flee into Europe, and the inability of the NATO countries to curtail or redirect their foreign policy is going to continue to force people to leave the African continent. And in leaving the African continent and flooding into Europe, the Europeans are saying, we don't want people from Africa, from West Asia, from South Asia, and so forth in our countries. It's destroying our country, it's destroying our culture, and so on and so forth. And you have the rise of the AFD and all these other parties. And in the United States, the rise of the MAGA Republicans. So the decline of socialism in many different geopolitical regions of the world has actually fueled the right-wing insurgency, or the rise of right-wing political parties, which, in my opinion, could not prevail either. They can do a lot of damage, but I do not believe they will come out victoriously, even during this current period of Donald Trump.
And again, after a long period of time, of a left wing party, in power in a place like Sao Tome, the right wing, or more honest right wing, mounted a political comeback, albeit a short one. How do you assess Evaristo Calvaro, his successor Gabriel Costa, both of the ADI during that time? And a follow-up question to that, because I have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to combine them. And then after their period, you had again from 2000 to 2006 the Movement for Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe. Social Democrat was back in power, and its leaders were Maria de Neves, then Damião Vaz de Lema, and Maria do Carmo Silveira. Did any of these leaders leave behind a positive left-wing legacy, or not so much? I'm curious your response.
I think they did the best they could under the circumstances they are facing. Anytime you have a split electorate and you have an ideological and political struggle between anti-imperialism, socialist orientation against neoliberalism, and a close alliance with the West, it will hamper economic development as well as political unity. But fortunately, it has not erupted in any type of violent civil war. But the ideological struggle continues, and it will continue because as the West becomes more and more imperialistic, for example, backing the IDF massive bombing of the Islamic Republic of Iran and other developments that are taking place in the so-called global South, will in fact put more pressure on these neoliberal parties, on these so-called right-wing and right-centrist or centrist-right parties in terms of their ability to govern, when in fact the Western countries that are backing them, that they're allied with, are growing deeper into crisis. Donald Trump could care less, if you have a right-wing, ideologically oriented party in Sao Tome and Principe. Only thing he's interested in is U.S. interests and U.S. imperialist interests, despite the fact that he claimed when he ran for office last year that he would not involve the United States in any type of extended imperialist war. And we see right now that was a bald-faced lie.
Exactly.
Because they're supplying, the warplanes, the bombs, the intelligence coordinates to the state of Israel that killed top military and political leaders, scientific specialists in the Islamic Republic of Iran for no reason. They claimed they were negotiating with the government about another nuclear agreement, which they had scrapped in 2017 after Trump came in office. They threw out the previous agreement, and now they said they were interested in negotiating another agreement. And while that negotiation was going on, they unleashed the Zionist regime to carry out these targeted assassinations and bombings of Iran. But the Iranians have struck back, and they're doing extensive damage in places like Tel Aviv, in Haifa, and other areas in occupied Palestine. So it's becoming clear that the US imperialists are in a deep crisis, and they pose no alternative to anti-imperialism and socialism. And alliances, for example, like BRICS, are becoming more and more attractive to people in the global South, even though they're not socialist. It's not socialist oriented, but at the same time, it does provide an alternative to what the U.S., Britain, France, Germany, and the other countries are doing at this particular time period in history.
Exactly. And from 2006 to 2008, the country of Sao Tome and Principe was led by Tome Veracruz of the right-leaning but socially liberal party, Force for Change Democratic Movement's Liberal Party. And then he was succeeded once more by the ADI, led by Patrice Travado, who again is in power, but only for a short period of time, just a little under a year, February to June 2008. Again, how do you assess the legacy of these two leaders?
Well, it was an attempt to move the country further to the right, to develop alliances with the United States, the current system in Portugal, but fundamentally does not improve the overall economic conditions inside of Sao Tome and Principe. And the formation of the U.S. Africa Command officially in February of 2008, under the guise of assisting AU member states in fighting terrorism and enhancing their own domestic security apparatus, has proved completely false. The security situation in Africa has worsened over the last 17 years since the formation of the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. We've seen the destruction of Libya. We've seen the overthrow of the progressive government in Cote d'Ivoire, of the former government there. We see the rise of Takfiri terrorist groups, whether it's in the Federal Republic of Nigeria, in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Cameroon. All these countries have been impacted by these so-called Takfiri groups that are allied with Al Qaeda and ISIS, which have their origins in U.S. intelligence. So the game that they're playing is to destabilize these countries, to provide a rationale for U.S. military involvement and a permanent presence on the continent.
And when you're an African when you're an African island nation like Cape Verde, Sao Tome Principe, Equatorial
Yes.
Guinea, Madagascar, but specifically a country like like Sao Tome, when you have all of those countries that are going through instability orchestrated by the West, like what happened in Libya, or the ongoing or the ongoing Western-backed aggression in Congo, or even when a place like Nigeria with its issues of Boko Haram. So when these countries catch a cold, there's a place like Sao Tome Principe. When they sneeze, the Sao Tome Principe basically get a cold.
I think what shielded them to a certain extent is the small population, the fact that these are island nations, and also the fact that they're pretty much uniform religiously. The overwhelming majority of the people on these islands are of the Roman Catholic faith. There's been some rise in Protestantism, but there's no really strong Islamic presence. So in terms of the ability of the CIA and all these other intelligence agencies based in the West, they need some type of base. Like, for example, if there was a small minority Islamic population, they could hire agents, to go and fight the central government. We saw that in Mozambique, another former Portuguese colony, where in the north, in Cabo Delgado, There's a group that surfaced several years ago calling itself Al-Shabaab, supposedly not affiliated with the Al-Shabaab in Somalia.
Okay,
But
yeah.
these people were provided with arms and military organization, and they were able for a while to shut down this liquefied natural gas project that the Mozambique government had established with ExxonMobil Corporation. And interestingly enough, the Southern African Development Community sent in their peacekeeping forces, but also the Rwandan Patriotic Front. The Rwandan Patriotic Government Army was hired by the administration in Mozambique, the Frelimo administration, to assist them in fighting these rebels who claimed to be Islamic rebels that were undermining this
Oh, wow.
liquefied natural gas project. So you have Rwandan forces in northern Mozambique that have been fighting alongside the Southern African Development Community forces. So this complicates the situation immensely, even in regard to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Because remember, the Southern African Development Community had sent in peacekeeping forces along with the United Nations, but you got this M23 insurgency that's backed by Rwanda. So the SEDC forces said they're going to withdraw. They're withdrawing now from the eastern DRC provinces of North and South Kivu. And there was a request for the Rwandan Patriotic Army to help in the evacuation from the eastern DRC. So this is a very complicated situation that's going on. But this may have somewhat shielded Sao Tome and Principe, even though there was an attempted coup several years ago, but it was put down rather rapidly.
That's
So
a perfect.
yes.
Well, that's a perfect segue into that's a perfect segue to this question, which is Joachim Rafael Branco of the Movement for Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe Social Democratic Party. When he was in power during this period, does he have a left wing legacy one can brag about, or not so much?
Well, I mean, the problem is now they're no longer a one party state. They have to consult with other people within the legislative apparatus of the country. And who do you rely on as allies? Angola has been a strong ally of Sao Tome and Principe, providing it with oil and other commodities for the country. But outside of that, they have very little support and very weak allies in that regard. So it's very limited in regard to what the MLSTP can do. The fact
Okay.
that they exist is a positive development, but it depends on what's going to happen with the IDA, whether they can sustain their thrust towards neoliberalism and some type of center-right political system in such a small country that is so underdeveloped and that has been so victimized by the legacy of slavery and colonialism.
It's interesting because following the leader I just mentioned, now a game of musical chairs keeps happening in Sao Tome
Right.
Principe from Bronco and the MLSTP when they leave power. So you have Patrice Travado. He comes to power
Yes.
again, a short period of time, 2010 to 2012. Then came a split within the party and the Union of Democrats for Citizenship and Development under the leadership of Gabriel Costa came to power, but they only lasted in power for a year. Patrice Travado came back into power and ruled uninterrupted for 4 years, 2014 to 2018. Then the Movement for the Liberation of Sao Tome and Principe Social Democratic Party comes back into power under Jorge Born Jesus and was in power for 3 years. Talk to us about that period. And how was it that, again, Patrice Travado comes back to power again for 2 years, 2022 to this year, 2025. And since then, he's had two successors, both from his party and from Sao Tome and Principe, and is currently led by Americo Ramos. How do you assess uh, yes, all this crazy musical chairs and all these people's time in office so far.
Yeah. Well, you got divisions that exist, ideological and political divisions inside the country. And you have defections. There are splits that take place both within the IDA as well as the MLSTP. And since the current administration from 2021, there's been very limited economic progress inside the country. So I don't think that the neoliberalism and the center-right trajectory is doing anything to improve the conditions of people inside of Sao Tome and Principe. The current leader right now has the image of being a moderate, but how is this really translating into economic policies that are really going to improve the country? They're still largely a agriculturally based national economy with the production and export of cocoa, and the failure of the petroleum industry to take off is and has been an impediment to the overall economic development of the country. So they'll have to figure out the MLSTP and the IDA a way forward for the country with a population of 225,000 people. This is why Pan-Africanism is so important, because there needs to be the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which the idea surfaced several years ago. They have a headquarters in Ghana, but at the same time, the transitional process is too slow to integrate the African economies. Sao Tome and Principe are examples of the fact that most of the trade that they engage in is with countries in Europe, particularly the former colonial power of Portugal. And there's really no mechanism that has been developed to facilitate inter-African trade, which would heavily benefit the people of Sao Tome and Principe.
This final question then, and in fact, you can even talk a bit more about that. So, final question is this: is there a strong, viable left alternative to the movement for liberation of Sao Tome and Principe? And what is the nation's relations to BRICS, or some within BRICS? And this is an island, like many island nations from the Caribbeans, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Papua New Guinea, and similar nations where there are actually obscene levels of inequality. And even if left policies get pushed, they get easily overturned or are undermined or sabotaged. So, what needs to happen for Sao Tome and Principe to to have a society where it's not a poor majority, but an advanced economy where the majority enjoy dignity, or what the late John Pilger called, common decency? I'm curious your response.
I believe that there has to be greater economic and political integration within the African Union member states region. I don't see any real alternative for a country that has 225,000 people, that has a historical legacy that goes back 5 centuries of enslavement, colonialism, forced labor, and deliberate destabilization and underdevelopment. So there has to be greater economic and political integration across the African continent. Otherwise, you are going to continue to experience instability and a lack of consistency in regard to political and economic policies. And the interesting factor about Sao Tome and Principe is that their history is so much integrated with Africans in Latin America and in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Just the demographic composition of Sao Tome and Principe. The Portuguese, when they went there, a lot of them were dying from tropical diseases. They were being killed by the Africans who were resisting slavery and colonialism. So they began to import Africans from other parts of the continent, from other islands, and even from the Western Hemisphere were brought in to work on the plantations and to provide the profit-making capability of the Portuguese colonialists. They also encouraged the Portuguese settlers to have children with African women. And then the offspring of these unions, which were heavily exploitative and unequal,
Yeah.
just like during the period of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Some of the offsprings were incorporated into the apparatus of governance within the slave and colonial system. Now that broke down on many occasions because people realized they were being exploited themselves, and then they would revolt against the very people that they had been collaborating with under the slave and colonial systems. Then they'd have to turn around and import more people from other parts of the continent. This had a lot to do with the uprising of 1953, where they were threatening to bring in Africans from Cape Verde and other places to usurp the labor power and the resistance that existed during that time period on the part of the people who were already there in Sao Tome and Principe. And even at that, it didn't work because people continued to organize, and the formation of the MLSTP in 1960 and CONCEPT in 1961 eventually led to the weakening of the Portuguese colonial system and the independence of the country. But as Nkrumah and many other socialist theoreticians and Pan-Africanist ideologues have said, the independence of any single African country is meaningless unless it's linked with the total liberation and unification of Africa, and that this process is part and parcel of the world socialist movement. And that is the only solution, in my opinion, that will bring development and prosperity to Africa and other underdeveloped states throughout the world. But in terms of their relationship with BRICS as a small island nation, I don't think they would be a candidate at this point for BRICS, but perhaps if they formed a closer alliance with Angola and other regional states, perhaps they could go in as a regional bloc and become members of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa Plus Summit, which is causing tremendous consternation and anxiety on the part of the West, even though that bloc is not socialist oriented at all. Exactly. But they're talking about de-dollarization, the decline. They're talking about declining their reliance on the US dollar and its dominance on international currency markets. And they're also building a new development bank that's headed by Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil and a leader of the Workers' Party of Brazil. Yes. So they're still concerned, about these calls for de-dollarization and what you see, like, for example, the axis of resistance. They're trying to destroy it right now, trying to destroy Hamas, Hezbollah. They've overthrown the government in Syria. They've been bombing Yemen, even though they have a temporary truce with Yemen. They still have a military base in Iraq, which they're worried right now that the Iraqi resistance forces and the Islamic Republic of Iran, the IRGC, will attack their bases in neighboring Iraq. So all of this is going on, and Trump and his MAGA Republican administration is trying to figure this out. They've given themselves 2 weeks in regard to how they should move forward, but they have a lot to contemplate because there are elements within the MAGA alliance which really believe that Trump was some type of anti-war figure. I don't know where they got that idea from, but they believe it. And even some people in the peace movement and on the so-called left in the United States believed that a Trump presidency would be better than a Harris-Walsh presidency, or be better than the Biden-Harris presidency because of their involvement in Ukraine and their involvement in the genocide in Gaza, that somehow under Trump, this would end. And it has not ended.
Exactly.
The ceasefire collapsed. Trump has done nothing, absolutely nothing, to reinstate the ceasefire in Gaza, to stop the attacks on the Palestinians in the West Bank. And now they're threatening a full-blown war with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also with Yemen, because Yemen says they will walk away from this truce with U.S. imperialism if the U.S. begins to bomb directly the people of the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're talking about dropping a 30,000 pound bomb on the country. This is insane, you know, and they did all this stuff against Afghanistan for 2 decades. They still lost. They still ran out of the country with their tails between their legs, just like they did in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And even in Iraq right now, even though they have a military base there, the majority of the people there, even the government in Iraq has passed numerous resolutions asking U.S. imperialist forces to leave. They also have forces in northeast Syria, and they're there. And the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad did not invite them there. This al-Qaeda surrogate government that exists now are collaborators with U.S. imperialism and Zionism.
Exactly.
So there's no solution in any alliance with U.S. imperialism. And we've had the Democrats and the Republicans, but underlying both of them is an imperialist foreign policy, which continues as we speak.
Exactly. And just a quick reminder before we close, Donald Trump always campaigned that he was going to rip up the Iran nuclear deal. And even if you did fall for his shtick that he was some kind of peacenik because he said one very good statement denouncing the Bush administration for the catastrophe that was the Iraq War, what did he do when he got into power? He immediately invited John effing Bolton to be a major foreign secretary. the guy who has a psychotic derangement obsession with Iran, and now yours truly, Donald Trump, is allowing Israel to bomb Iran, and so exactly.
Yeah, he got rid of Bolton in his first term because it appeared as if Bolton wanted a full-scale war with Iran. Trump was not prepared for that during that time period. Now they're contemplating whether, you know, to do a massive bombing of Iran. But even at that, if the government is strong and united, they will not come down. They'll have to deploy hundreds of thousands of ground troops into the Islamic Republic of Iran to topple the government. They're hoping they can topple the government through the targeted assassinations of the military leaders, political leaders, and other important figures inside the country.
Even the supreme leader. And I'm just hoping.
Yeah.
I mean, worst case scenario, if they do overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran, heaven forbid they don't, here's hoping at least that the Islamic Republic of Iran, like the fallen Syrian Arab Republic, is able to give them a pretty bloody good fight and resistance. But yeah, but here's hoping that doesn't happen. And on that note, I also, want to encourage anyone who watches 1+1 so forth to go out and protest. And even if there is no actions going out in wherever you're, in wherever you live, because there's no prominent peace group, anti-imperialist group, and whatnot, then find out where the Israeli embassy is in your country, or the American embassy, or do a little elementary research into what your own country is doing, and protest at the embassies, protest at the town halls, protest at where your heads of state are going, because Iran needs us, the world needs us in solidarity against this ghastly system of Western imperialism.
Yeah, here in Detroit, we're holding a public meeting Monday on the war. Look at the history of Iran, going back to the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953 by the U.S. and Britain, and also the revolution of 1979, and how this coincides with the genocide that's going on in Gaza and throughout the Palestinian territories. And we will discuss trying to organize a demonstration in this area against what Israel and the United States are both doing. There have been demonstrations inside of Iran that have been huge, even today. In Yemen as well, huge demonstrations even today. And as I said, the Yemeni Ansar Allah resistance forces are saying that their truce with the U.S. Will be over
Yeah.
the minute that the United States drops a
Well, and I,
bomb
well,
in the Islamic Republic of Iran.
and I also have to say you're very lucky because you're in Detroit, which has not where not only can you get a lot of black people out to demonstrate, but you have a good amount of white working class folks, but also Dearborn, which is the center and one of the biggest populations
Yeah, Arab Americans.
of a broad Middle East
It's a
diaspora.
lot of them
So,
from Lebanon that are here, Palestinians. Yeah, so they're around. And so we have to work with those communities, the progressive elements in those communities that are willing to stand up to fight against the U.S. imperialist alliance, with Zionism that's carrying out the genocide in Palestine. All these issues are related to the call for AFRICOM and the French Foreign Legion to be withdrawn from the African continent. We see that happening in the Sahel and other areas. So the U.S. is quite worried. This whole notion of making America great again is a misnomer. It is absurd. It is absolutely absurd, considering what we've been talking about today, the history of slavery and colonialism. Western imperialism was built on these exploitative systems. So we have to fight them, even in the 21st century.
and this is really all hands on deck moment in
Exactly.
history. Well, we were joined on this All Things Africa edition, learning about the history and current affairs of Sao Tome and Principe, with our always wonderful returning champion, historian, journalist, Pan-Africanist, leftist, and all-round anti-imperialist and supporter of all people power movements, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Check out his work and all of his appearances on 1+1. Subscribe to Pan-African Newswire and Bar. Donate generously to them. And don't forget to do the same for 1+1. Donate to us, share widely all of 1+1's content, and encourage others to like us and again share and donate. Next week, the next country we'll be exploring, looking at my map of Africa, it's going to be a lot of zigzagging right now. But the next country the next country that we will be exploring is Nigeria, which I'm really excited about. I've been having Fela Kuti stuck in the back of my head for the past couple of episodes. So I'm really looking forward to exploring.
Well, he was
Nigeria.
given a award recently by a Grammy Award for the greatest.
You mean him posthumously,
Fela.
or his son?
Posthumously, yeah, Fela
Okay.
Kuti, or
Yeah.
Fela Ransom, which I had the honor of seeing live in concert 3 times.
Oh, nice.
The 1980s, early 1990s, and he passed away in 1997. But yeah, he's still remains a monumental figure in African cultural history. Yeah, so I think that's important that he was finally recognized by the U.S. media establishment.
Exactly, and I'm really looking forward to exploring his impact on Nigeria, because one cannot talk about Nigerian history without talking about Fela. So join us next week. So folks, join us next week for that. Have a great weekend, folks. Good night, and good luck. All my best. Oh, and just one more reminder, folks, before I press the stop the record button. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, 1+1 is having I don't want to call it censorship yet, but we are having problems sharing on content. I am blocked at the moment from my own personal Facebook from sharing my content. So again, do the following: go to 1+1, go to the YouTube channel, and Abayomi. So explain to people how you share and are able to share.
Yeah, I just went to the YouTube channel and I copied the link and just pasted the link into my Facebook page, and I was able to share it that way. Now, it doesn't say it's blocked, but they have all kinds of ways of shadow blocking content. They've been doing this for years. Even on Google, for example, they've been doing it for years. A lot of groups, got a lot more attention just through a regular search until they start tampering with, the algorithms to downgrade left-wing websites and so forth. So it's an ongoing struggle. It
and
really is.
and another tip. That being said, and another tip, folks, is when you share 1+1, you can share, you can put us on Twitter, you can share on Facebook. But if you're having problems with that, you can also, if you have a lot of friends who like content like this, email it to them.
Right.
And I especially encourage left-wing groups that I'm associated with, left-wing groups I'm often in touch with. Please, do share 1+1's content, on your emailing list. It would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, they can copy and paste the links into the email, and they can even copy and paste your information, the promotional information describing the show, and send it out via email. See how that turns out.
Exactly. And it would be greatly appreciated if people did that. Until
Right.
then,
Yeah.
everybody have a good weekend. And yes, and join us next week for Nigeria. Ciao till then.